BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And boy, do we have a turning point for you ready today. I'm very glad and proud to welcome Georgios Varouxakis to my program, professor for the history of political thought at Queen Mary's University in London. What a wonderful job to have, Georgios.
Thank you.
You have authored a book that has become very widely reviewed and very well reviewed called The West, the History of an Idea. And frankly, there couldn't be a more topical moment than these days to talk about it, because on Friday we had the publication of a new American security strategy. So the official leading document for American foreign policy, which makes it pretty clear, and this is really interesting, that Europe is the real enemy. Europe is not only, according to the authors of this document, who seem to smell very much like J.D. Vance, at risk of civilizational erasure, so Europe gone, but the American government sees it also as its task to encourage resistance to the way Europe is going at the moment, and to encourage especially what they call patriotic parties, which are, the AFD, the Nigel Farages, the Giorgia Melonis, etc. of this world. And if there ever was a West, it's gone now, Georgios. What do you say?
I say you're right that my book is very timely because exactly this debate is happening. But I beg to differ with them, of course. The West does not mean what J.D. Vance and Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and many other speechwriters of President Trump now or in his first term assume it means. What they are very clever about, or rather lucky about, is that they have managed to almost monopolize the use of the term, because everybody else, because of how they feel about the people who use the terms Western civilization and West often, don't want to go anywhere near it. And that is a very serious own goal, as one would say in football.
It's a very serious own goal, just like the left not talking about migration and therefore leaving...
And
patriotism and leaving this whole to the other side, as it were. But let's just stick to this document for a moment, because it's such an important historic moment. What this security strategy describes about Europe, the risk of civilizational erasure, the problems with migration, that looks like a fairly bad case of projection. This is describing the fears of the American right far more than the reality of Europe. And also it occurs to me that if they see Europe as the real enemy, if they say, basically our beef with China is economic, and that's the only difference we really have. Our problem with Russia is that there's this annoying little war on, but then we've got great opportunities for mineral deals. But Europe is a real problem. My question is, you're the historian of ideas. My question is, there is no worse civil war than a civil war between brothers who disagree about the interpretation of their legacy. And this work, this document is so full with ideas like liberty and democracy and sovereignty, all of which, the American right feels terribly threatened. But isn't there also a fundamental disagreement going on between, at the moment, a more liberal Europe and a more reactionary America about what the legacy of the West really means?
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with your initial statement, projection. I can't remember, I wish I could remember or had gone to my notes from some psychology session where I noticed it, I wrote it down. I think it's called shadowing. When you see in your partner or your brother or somebody at work things that you hate about yourself, that are scaring you about yourself, you become aggressive towards them, because the thing you notice in them, which might be in a very small extent true of them and much more of you, scares you so much that you get angry. So exactly that was my first reaction when I saw that document, because the things it says, Western civilization's greatest danger at the moment, in my humble opinion, is the policy and the rhetoric of the Trump administration on a number of fronts. The way it is destroying the soft power and the norms that have been for a very long time one of the greatest assets of the West, both sides of the West. The way we cannot, from now on, for a foreseeable future that is scary, tell anybody, don't do that, it's against international law, when the American president speaks and behaves the way he does. So for them to say the EU is the greatest danger to Western civilization is quite rich, to be honest. Secondly, of course, they are a reaction to something they see as extreme. That extreme they see as scary and react to, again, it's not in Europe, it's American. Europe has just been importing it partly. I am not here to say that there is a black and white, there are black and white sides in any debate. There is a reaction to extremes to which some people in America, including academics, have gone in recent years and decades. Some of them are decades, some of them became accentuated and almost, yes, accentuated is the word I can think of now, since the death of George Floyd. So what they see as the woke movement and its excesses, of course there are excesses that have happened and rhetoric that has been used by Elon Musk and his megaphones, of course, to discredit the Democrats in America. But that doesn't mean that that's all there is in Europe. This is imported from America. So as you started by saying, this is definitely projecting your own anxieties on your sister or brother in Europe. So the people I'm talking about that Trump is reacting against have been treating the West as if it means white supremacism, racism, imperialism, and all the crimes of civilization and history since ever, forgetting that slavery existed in every society we know of. A Western power abolished it at great cost to itself, Britain, thanks to the
abolitionist movement.
To the abolitionist movement and some Christians who thought this cannot go on. Obviously, people in America fought as well to abolish slavery with the Civil War. And I stand to be corrected. Obviously, I don't pretend to be a specialist in every civilization that has existed. But if there is anything distinctive about the West, it is not that it is the most criminal or the most at fault than any civilization. It is that it's the one that has been ashamed of itself quite a bit and has been trying very hard to rectify, allows itself to the self-criticism that leads to movements that rectify. So the woke movement is, of course, a very much a Western movement. It's an outcome of Western liberalism, an outcome of the self-criticism and so on. So many of these statements have been extreme. Many of them have been threatening freedom of speech, but nowhere more than in American universities. So again, for the Americans to say that all these dangers are European is exactly what you started by saying, projecting their own anxieties on Europe.
Let me just pick you up on that before we come to the actual idea of the West, because what you mentioned here is very important, namely the West is not the only political force that has exercised power and has exercised power brutally, but it's the only one that is ashamed of it. That seems to me such an interesting point also about the whole development of European intellectual history, because there's this wonderful bit in the Odyssey where Odysseus is complaining that the gods are still punishing him. And he says, I'm a decent guy. We recently raided this little town. And we killed the men and we raped the women, and I didn't take more women than my companions. And you see there the image of a culture that is not Christian, where violence has a completely different place, where, if you're beaten, then it's vae victis, woe to the defeated, and anything can happen to you. And if you're the victor, you can do whatever the hell you like. That's how the world works. Then Christianity comes, and it's the religion of love. But of course, the systematic or systemic violence in the society doesn't vanish. It stays as bad as it was before. But now all of a sudden you have that enormous chasm between the practice and the theory. And you need a whole class of interpreters, of theologians, of philosophers, of artists, of writers, to close that chasm, to show you that the practice of society isn't at all in contradiction to the religion that it has espoused, but that it is actually the same.
Yes, very much so. Brilliantly put again. And one of the people that get... I try to be neutral in the book, and I try not to show my admiration for some thinkers more than others, but try to present the gamut of definitions and attitudes towards the West. And the book discusses dozens and hundreds, really, of some more, some less, of thinkers and journalists and politicians and philosophers. But one of the people where I cannot hide my admiration in my style is Simone Weil, who, of course, famously discussed the Iliad as a poem of force.
A great female writer, theologian, philosopher, Jewish, converted to Catholicism in the 1930s.
Yes, but who meanwhile criticizes the West for having adopted the wrong type of idea of glory, the Roman idea of glory, which is based on conquest. And probably she lets the Greeks get away too easily because, of course, she says the Greeks became imperialists later. Initially, they were not, and so on. Anyway, her admiration for Greece had no bounds. And her target was Rome because it based the idea of glory on the idea of force and conquest. And she famously wrote in several essays and also in her most famous book, L'Enracinement, The Need for Roots, that sadly what now we are protesting about the Nazis doing to us is what we have been doing to the Vietnamese, the Annamites, and the Algerians and all the other colonies. So a decade before Aimé Césaire became famous for arguing the same thing, she had already written in various works that she wrote during the Second World War that very sadly France had been doing to its colonies what France is done by the Nazis now. And what we need in the future is a very different conception of patriotism that bases itself not on La France éternelle or the idea of glory based on power and conquest, but rather on compassion for your country, which is vulnerable, which of course allows you to have compassion for everybody else's country, including the country of the Vietnamese and so on. So a road not taken, but the kind of self-criticism I was talking about earlier that is allowed in the West. And may we remind your listeners, she wrote these things in L'Enracinement, which was a report for the Free French of General de Gaulle in London. De Gaulle was the most famous person who insisted on the idea of La France éternelle. And she wrote there, the ideas like La France éternelle are idolatrous in the first place because nothing is eternal in this world. Nations are not eternal. They are creations of human beings, historical creations that come and go. So anyway, and there are many others. One of the things I would like also to comment on what you said about Christianity and its role, of course, and the discrepancy is how this ethic, this morality of equality does, as you imply very correctly, come to this world with Christianity. The idea there is no Jew or Greek, woman or man, slave or free, but we are all one in Jesus Christ, comes with the New Testament. And of course, Christians have been trying since then to adapt to it and failing, some more, some less, obviously, as you again imply. But I agree with Alexis de Tocqueville, who lost his faith himself and who said the Christian morality has permeated the Christendom, the world of Christendom, even if you don't accept the theological premises. And therefore, there are all sorts of cultural and moral implications about the mores of the world, which we call the West and he called Christendom in the 19th century. And people like John Stuart Mill, who was not taught to be a Christian, he was agnostic. He was not an atheist, as people always say. He was an agnostic. He was clear, I don't know if there is a God. I can't prove there is one. I can't prove there isn't. But he also insisted we do not need now to believe in a God and a revelation to live by the principles that we now think are right, as we were first told by that revelation. So there is a whole series of philosophical reflection on how you can abide by the morality of justice and equality and other things that Christianity prevailed in persuading people are good, without necessarily believing in God, because otherwise, if God is dead, as we were told by not just Nietzsche but also Auguste Comte, we are of course in trouble in believing any morality unless we have one that is secular, even if we don't agree on revelation. And one of the people that I find interesting in my book, and he turns out to be probably the protagonist of the book by then, is the African-American novelist Richard Wright, who was passionately, viscerally, aggressively anti-religious because of observing the profound religiosity of his grandmother, which he thought led her to resignation about all her miseries. And he thought that is not a very good way of living. So he was a kind of radical Enlightenment figure, passionately believing in the Enlightenment in a way that might be naive or one-sided. But he defined himself as Western, and he insisted, I think I'm more Western than the West. That's the problem. The West is not Western enough. It is not, as you say, as you implied, very correctly again, the West is not living up to its principles, which I subscribe to. I want the West to live by those principles. I am happy to be Western because of these principles. Why don't Western governments live by them? And he became a kind of, literally, in the way Socrates was the gadfly of Athenian democracy, Richard Wright, I would say, became the gadfly of the West. He was asking the West to do the Western thing.
So let's dig in, because now we've come across this word and we are happy to use it. The West is a little bit like pornography. It's very hard to define, but I know it when I see it. So when you read your book, it becomes clear this is actually quite a recent idea. You know, in the West, especially sort of around the time of the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the 80s and 90s, there was this idea, this famous phrase, Plato to NATO. And there was this unbroken cultural continuity, and we were building directly on the classical legacy, on the legacy of classical Greece and classical antiquity. It's not quite as simple, is it?
No. But I try to make a distinction between the West as a self-description, as an identity, as the way people describe themselves, which I think is recent, begins in the 1820s, gets more and more traction and becomes more and more used from the 1830s to the 1840s. And by the 1840s, the philosopher Auguste Comte becomes obsessively keen to promote this new term and call what he was talking about the West as opposed to Europe, for concrete reasons that I will not bore your listeners with at this stage, although they can find them in chapter 2 of the book. So that is one thing.
No, but bore us a little bit with that, because I mean, this is really important. I mean, if you mean the reaction to Russia,
I will, but I will try to finish the distinction, because I don't want to be misunderstood. That the people in question got inspiration by all sorts of traditions, texts, thinkers, religions, philosophies in the past, which eventually go all the way to ancient Greece. I'm not disputing that, obviously. That Plato is very important for us, and that our whole philosophy is a footnote on Plato in some sense, as has been said with felicitously somehow. I'm not disputing that. What I'm disputing is that the self-description, the decision to be the West as opposed to Christendom or Europe, these things, words matter. That's part of one of the main arguments of my book. Words are not innocent. They matter. They matter in politics. The trouble is they mean many different things to different people, and that's why you need to define them, and you need to clash with people when they misrepresent them or represent them as it suits them. So to that extent, Plato to NATO as a tradition of philosophy, as Christianity as very important for the West, all these things are true. I'm not disputing them. What I'm saying is that, for example, Edward Said's work is completely irrelevant to my book Whatever one thinks of Said's argument that the Europeans, the Westerners, as he would put it, othered, exoticized, and lumped together an East in order to feel better about themselves, which of course is correct in its main outlines. People have criticized the details of his scholarship. That's not my job. But that is irrelevant to what I'm doing, which is, yes, but they were very happy to other, exoticize, lump together the East, but they went on calling themselves Christendom or Europe as of the end of the 17th century and increasingly in the 18th. Why do they need a different word? And there my answer unequivocally is Russia. They need a different word when, after the Napoleonic Wars, more and more people, especially in France and increasingly in Germany, become very worried about the role of Russia, that Russia had been accepted as part of Europe after the reforms of Peter the Great. And so in terms of the geopolitics of Europe, the political system of the great powers, it was seen as European. Culturally, spent a lot of money, built St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea, invited Diderot and great architects and authors and philosophers to St. Petersburg. It had a German queen, Catherine the Great, and so on. So suddenly, after the Napoleonic Wars, at the Congress of Vienna, Russia is not just a European power, it dominates it. It's the center of Europe. Alexander I dominates the conversations, creates a narrative that puts Russia at the center. Very soon he establishes the Holy Alliance. So more and more people start thinking, wait a minute, they are usurping Europe. This is not the real Europe that we were thinking of. So they start talking about l'Occident, the West. Abendland, of course, exists in German. In Germany, you have 3 terms for the West. They don't exactly mean the same thing, but they are all important and useful. So to that extent, yes, that is what is recent, and that is what I have found consistent, to my great surprise, that anxiety about Russia, fear of Russia, which is a monolith, which is a very big power, which was ambitious to conquer countries further west. And, your neighbors in Poland and in the Baltic republics know extremely well about all this and don't need anybody to remind them. So that anxiety was always there. And when people talked about themselves in the West, they were always thinking of Russia as the other, with the sole exception, once Hitler invaded it, it became an ally of the Western powers. And for a few years, it was seen as a member of Western civilization until the onset of the Cold War in 1947 changed all that immediately.
It's very interesting that you say that, because, of course, this mirrors Russian discussions at the time, discussions that still have a tradition going on today between the Westerners and the Slavophiles. And the question, is Russia part of the West, or is it actually an Asian power? Is it its own? Does it have its own destiny?
Yeah, of course. And in German discussion, because Germans were ambivalent about their own position, are they Europe or are they West? Dostoevsky was a major influence. Danilevsky was a major influence on Spengler, although Spengler agreed with Danilevsky's circles of civilization idea, but he saw Germany as part of the Abendland, not as... he wasn't ambivalent about that. That's another interesting chapter, of course, the First World War and the interwar period. But yes, absolutely, Russians were discussing these things very passionately, and some of those texts, of course, were translated, so there was impregnation either way. The Russians were reading French and German authors, of course, very much.
Speaking about the German discussions at the time, also those discussions have their echoes in today's discussions about Russia and Germany's posture towards Russia. And this idea that there's somehow Germany has a special relationship with Russia and should show Russia more understanding than other powers. But you've mentioned a wonderful kickoff point here, namely Mr. Spengler, Oswald Spengler. Who was Oswald Spengler? Oswald Spengler was what you call in German a Privatgelehrter, a private scholar. He wasn't a professor anywhere. Nobody knew of him, but he was working away for decades on this gigantic work, The Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, in which he makes the point. It became a huge bestseller. It became sort of the emblem of cultural pessimism at its time. We're all going down the plug hole and it's all too late already. But acquaint us a bit with his central ideas, and what position you've sort of sketched a row of ancestors that has a lot to do with Auguste Comte, has a lot to do with John Stuart Mill, therefore also with a largely liberal tradition. These are not socialist thinkers or nationalist thinkers. These are really the fathers of liberal thought. But how does Spengler fit into this? He's in the 1920s, but how does he fit into this whole web of ideas?
He's fascinating and central, as you correctly say, and as you know, as you say, he was a loner. He was not a professor or a leader of some magazine or movement and so on. And he hit at an idea long before the First World War. He says that he started thinking of the argument in 1911, and the book was written as a draft when the war started, the Great War started. So he was very lucky because it was published at the very end of the war. That kind of pessimism and apocalyptic message became immediately extremely popular, initially in Germany and then in the rest of the world. And it's debatable whether if he had published a book in before the war, it would have had so much impact. It has often correctly been called more of a poetic or artistic or lyrical work than a work of scientific history. He insists in ways that are reminiscent of the importance of language in German thinkers from Herder and Fichte onwards, that the meaning of the words, you have to feel them. You can't translate some of them and so on. So you have to feel what I mean, and much of that. So, but the big message that is unmissable is the following. Everybody in Germany was talking, of course, as you know, about civilization versus culture, and we're making a kind of geographical and cultural and political distinction between themselves as having culture that is deeper, as opposed to the epidermic, superficial civilization in which the French and the Americans and the English excel, which is more materialist, selfish, and so on. The Germans have culture, which has various similarities with the way the Russians saw of themselves, of course. He comes and changes the meaning of this distinction into temporal, and he's very explicit in the introduction to the book. I am going to use these terms in a completely different way. So instead of civilization is the Western enemies of the Germans, and we are culture, he says civilization is the last stage of a culture when it's no longer a culture producing organically, creatively, as it was doing in the past. When it has petrified, it has become a museum piece. And we all, Germans and West Europeans and Americans, all of us, the Abendland, have passed into this last stage of our culture already by 1800. By the end of the 18th century, what was the culture of the West that had started in the 9th or 10th century with the Middle Ages stopped being a culture and became a petrified civilization.
Why? What petrified it? How did it run out of steam?
According to his theory, which, as I mentioned, was following Danilevsky, who he had heard of, he spoke some Russian, so it's not 100% sure whether he had read him or he was told by his Russian friends. It's the belief that every civilization has a cycle of around 1,000 years. So the West started in the beginning of the millennium, the second millennium. It's now reaching its by 2000 it will be over, and somebody else will take over, probably the Slavs, says he, following Danilevsky, which is perhaps a reason why he's so popular in Russia right now.
Perhaps Putin has also read Danilevsky.
And if not Putin, certainly Mr. Dugin.
Alexander Dugin has probably read Danilevsky, yes. Certainly read Danilevsky.
Most certainly, yes. And there was a whole Eurasianist movement in the 1920s in Russia that all these people have been reading very carefully. And another thinker, incidentally, parenthesis, that I discuss a lot in my book, a French musicologist and indologist, not musicologist, indologist, René Guénon, who converted to Islam when he went to Egypt, became a Sufi. So René Guénon, because he promoted the idea that the enemy is modernity, that the enemy of all civilizations, including the Western civilization, when it was a normal civilization, is modernity. So that these ideas are very popular with Dugin. He says he's inspired by him. He mentions him in his book, as well as by Steve Bannon and many other people. It is not, I don't think it's accidental. If you go to the internet and look for René Guénon, you will realize all his works have been translated to English. Those that were not translated decades ago have been translated in recent years, all of them, and they are online for free, open access. Somebody's paying for these things. Somebody's promoting these ideas. Anyway, so end of parenthesis. Back to Spengler. So that was, of course, part of the reason why it was so popular in Germany, because instead of feeling we are defeated, the Germans were told we are all doomed long ago, as you said earlier. It's not just who won the war, it's a much longer story. What I find fascinating and discuss in the book is how the language of Thomas Mann begins to change, whereas during the First World War, in the Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen and other works, he speaks as if it's a kind of stream of conscience, an attack on the Westernizers and civilization and his brother Heinrich, who was too Francophile and too democratic.
And too successful.
Yes, he begins to use the language of Spengler as soon. I went to the diaries and know when he started reading Spengler. And then you notice letters he sends to people after he starts reading Spengler. He starts saying, oh, it's a consolation after all. We are all doomed. Well, it may be okay. The world will become... And he starts using civilization in the temporal sense, in the sense of a culture that is no longer... has no longer creative juices, but has become petrified. So the influence of Spengler is unmistakable in his initial reaction to the defeat of Germany in 1919.
There's one other element that feeds into this whole ideology, and then we'll probably go back to the idea of the West, but it's quite interesting to see how these puzzle pieces fit together. And that idea is anti-Semitism. Very importantly at the time, because this is an interesting thing. I'm sitting in Vienna here, and Vienna was really a test case for migration policy, but also migration failure. Vienna, before the Austro-Hungarian Empire got a new constitution in 1867, so people could move freely, which a lot of Jews who lived in Galicia and what's today Ukraine, what's today Romania, etc., used to move to Vienna. So Vienna had, in the 1860s, first community of about 20,000 Jewish people. By 1918, they had 200,000 Jewish people. And because Judaism is a culture that is very highly associated with the importance of learning, with the importance of arguments, of language, etc., more than with manual work, you can see that very clearly statistically. You've got less than 10%, just less than 10% of Jews in the city. You've got 20% of pupils at higher schools are Jewish. And in the faculties of law and medicine and also in journalism, it's almost 50% of people who are Jewish, which means they were very strongly associated with the modernity that was destroying people's traditional lives. If you were a shoemaker and you were making shoes and there was a shoe factory opening next door, you could be fairly sure that somebody in the managing board of the factory was Jewish. And therefore, the Jews became very much, and of course, you couldn't compete with the factory. You had to close, the factory would take over. So the idea that this temporal civilization that is not culture, that is destroying culture, that is sort of overcoming an older traditional society, became very closely associated with anti-Semitism, the kind of anti-Semitism that then erupted in the Second World War. We've been speaking about Oswald Spengler and the end of the West, but we're talking about that because the real end of the West may be today with America's official divorce from Europe. But you also make the point that the West used to be Europe and America was an offshoot or a late joiner to this idea. That would be something that would surprise a few of our American listeners.
Yes, yes. My book is full of surprises, and I wish the blurb was page two of my preface, as opposed to my current blurb, because I described there five, six sets of surprises. The reader will be completely astonished to read.
Okay, surprise us.
One of them is that instead of being a kind of extension of Anglo-America or the Anglosphere, the West, on the contrary, was a Franco-German idea. It had a Franco-German and West European core, and the last country to join as a member of the West in terms of self-description, the last country to accept we are part of the West and Western civilization was the United States. They were the most reluctant, not least because, and the British came after the French and Germans, and I argue in a chapter in the book that always through German and French influences, always through people who had lived in Germany or France or followed French and German philosophers, and there is a reason for that. L'Occident, of course, was part of German and French history. It was the empire of Charlemagne, Karl the Grosse, was claiming to be the Roman Empire. He was crowned Imperator Romanorum in 1800, except he couldn't be called Imperator Romanorum seriously because there was an emperor in Constantinople who was there with more or less uninterrupted continuity. So she was conveniently a woman for a couple of years, but then a man was there. So what he could hope to claim and did claim and succeeded in claiming is Emperor of the West, of the Western Roman Empire, successor to the Western Roman Empire that had been dissolved in the 5th century, more or less. So for the French and the Germans, when they would talk of l'Occident, it was historically part of their history. So the word was more available than in English. Britain was more insular. It was never part of it.
Britain also had its empire. Britain was much more. I mean, I remember driving in a car with an old gentleman who was a member of the House of Lords, who told me, well, you know, as far as I'm concerned, Bombay and Delhi will always be closer than Paris and Berlin. In his mental geography, because that was where Britain was oriented. So small wonder that Britain wasn't. Britain was quite reluctant also to buy into that club.
Yes, and small wonder that in the end Brexit happened, although, of course, there are all sorts of incidental reasons and personal reasons of demagogic intent that contributed to it, but that the ambivalence has always been there is related. As Jules Michelet would start his lectures on English history every year by saying, Messieurs, his students were men then, Messieurs, l'Angleterre est une île. Vous en savez maintenant autant que moi sur son histoire. Gentlemen, England is an island. You now know as much as me about its history. It was his funny way, his witty way to say this is a very different country because it's insular. But America had even more reasons, because America, of course, was the first post-colonial nation. They had rebelled against the British Empire. By then, it became a bitter struggle. They've had another war in 1812. So the last thing the Americans would want in their first decades would be to be associated with these imperialistic, semi-feudal, aristocratic European kingdoms and principalities. They were a city in the hill. They were a new dispensation. They had all their preachers over the 17th and 18th century, and now with their new narrative of independence and Declaration of Independence and the Republic, they were a new dispensation. So they were the last to join, and they joined only through the influence of Germans. My chapter on how America joined the West as a self-description is called Ex Germaniae Lux, ? Light from Germany. How did the idea of the West reach America? And I show there that Germans, but also Americans who went to study in German universities, because American universities wouldn't grant PhDs. And every self-respecting graduate of Harvard who wanted to do further study would go to Göttingen, Berlin, Halle, or Heidelberg. So through their influence back home and through the influence of German migrants, not least Franz Lieber, who became the founder of American social science, political science, the editor of the first American Encyclopedia Americana, and many other things. And then endless numbers of Americans who studied in German universities, which included W.E.B. Du Bois, by the way, who loved the experience and loved Europe because he studied in Berlin in the 1890s.
A very important black political theorist and one of the first black really major voices that America had.
Yes, exactly. The doyen of black intellectuals for many decades. So that's one of the surprises that the Americans. So as to come back to what you said, because I'm prone to open digressions. Exactly. So the West as a self-description was first of all invented in France and Germany. It's a Franco-German concept. And the core was Western Europe. America joined reluctantly by the end of the 19th century. Only by the end of the 19th century do you have Americans talking about themselves as part of the West and Western civilization and take it for granted. Before that, it was a fight, a struggle that people like Lieber had to conduct. And I have a lot of proof in the book of that, very clear proof of his frustration. Why don't we have a term to describe ourselves and the Europeans? We are the same civilization, but we don't have a term for this. Of course, the decisive and irreversible moment was the First World War, when the boys had to go and die in Flanders. The Americans needed to explain to the boys and to the public why.
To their parents, yes.
Yes. So they started the courses in Western civilization that started at Columbia University and then in other American universities. And for between the 1920s and 1960s, shaped generations of Americans to see themselves as the culmination of Western civilization.
So this chapter of the West is also a creature of the First World War.
Yes, the success of the narrative in America only was reached in the First World War. And crucial people there, I discuss a literary critic and novelist, John J. Chapman, who was very passionate in his Francophilia and his desire for the Americans to join the West. And he wrote famously, we are Europeans. We have to join back the fold. We have to be taken back in the fold. We cannot pretend we're a different dispensation. We can't pretend we're a different culture. This nonsense of American exceptionalism has to stop. Things that should be repeated in every American school and every American newspaper every day on the top, if I ruled the world. And then the most consequential person, of course, was Walter Lippmann, the most influential journalist of the 20th century, a major thinker, philosopher, Harvard teaching assistant of George Santayana before he went to journalism. He just dominated American journalism from the First World War to the late 1960s. And he explicitly and repeatedly kept saying during the First World War from 1915 onwards, we have to support the Western allies, because if not civilization, our civilization is at stake. The people who now rule Germany, if they prevail, they will destroy a civilization we are part of. And he was wise enough and precise enough to insist, but we have to treat Germany gently. We have to reinforce the elements in Germany that Germany belongs to Western civilization, he insisted. Their current leaders, the Prussian military aristocracy, who don't see things that way, we have to defeat them, but reinforce the rest of the Germans to believe that to come back to the fold of the civilization they belong to. So it's Winkelmann avant la lettre, what a German historian came to tell the Germans as of the 1990s and 2000s. Lippmann, who was of German Jewish origin, kept saying to the Americans, we have to be careful how we treat the Germans after a victory. We have to not be seen as vindictive and reinforce the enemies of Western civilization, for whom, of course, always the bugbear is going to be the West and the Western democracies and so on. As you know, the treaties were vindictive, as you know very well, and we all know what happened with the German population and its resentment and what it led to. So I wish more people had listened to Lippmann during the First World War and after.
There's one or two things I'd like to explore with you. First of all, now we've talked about, shall we say, the spread of the idea, but not yet much of about the content. And then I'm also very interested in the carriers of this idea. But the content, I mean, What the hell does it mean, the West? It's obviously got something to do with democracy, something to do with a classic civilization and what it's left, something to do with a Christian heritage, but also with the Enlightenment. I mean, there's a whole, the whole bag of big words there. What, I mean, and obviously the West has over the 100 years or 200 years that it's been used meant different things to different people. But, what does this term, is this term useful at all still, or has it become so emptied of all specificity that it can just mean anything?
Very good. Extremely good question. Very challenging, as I expected from you, but I hope I have a coherent answer.
I'm sure you will.
The answer is complex because the reality is complex. So, of course, the term, and some people think I've tried to deconstruct the West by showing that it has meant completely different things over its history in the last 200 years. I don't try to deconstruct it. I just try to do a historical genealogy of the many meanings it has acquired. Part of my argument, I'm following Nietzsche's approach to genealogy there, which is that you cannot offer a correct definition of something with such a long history. You can only trace the different layers of meanings that have been deposited time after time, because there is a battle for the meaning of the term, as there is a battle right now, which is being won by certain political forces because we allow them to win, because we don't touch the term, because they touch it. And that's exactly what I'm trying to reverse, if possible, or alert people to rethink. So part of the story of the idea of the West as of Christianity in Nietzsche's genealogy, as of everything that has a long history, is that things come back. Things that were in the earlier layers don't completely disappear. That's part of the argument in Nietzsche's genealogy. They don't disappear. They lay dormant. So they come back depending on who uses the terms, who has the power, of course, to have a megaphone to shout louder. Particular aspects, particular meanings, particular interpretations get the upper hand. So it's an ongoing battle. That's part of my argument. It's a battle. We are battling. We're redefining the term as we are speaking. Ukraine is being considered for membership of the West, and arguably is fighting for the West in way Western Europeans are not prepared to fight. And but if you read Samuel Huntington in the 1990s, in his definition of civilizations, he was predicting that there will never be serious violence between Ukrainians and Russians because they both belong to the Russian Slavic civilization, and by definition, they won't fight each other that very hard. His major problem was his obsession with religion. Your religion is your fate. And he didn't allow the possibility of people changing. Although theoretically, he wrote, people can change civilization. It doesn't happen in a day, but the people can change civilization in its history through decisions, through being admitted, of course, through mutual decisions. But in practice, he was too deterministic about religion. If you are not part of Western Christendom, Protestant or Catholic, you're not Western. And that I'm criticizing in my book, and I'm giving examples, including modern Greece, which was more or less co-opted from the beginning, both by publicists who were writing during the Greek Revolution in the 1820s and saying Greece is going to be the rampart of the West against the real danger, which is Russia, not the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is moribund. I'm not judging whether they are right or wrong. I'm saying how the idea started. The Ottoman Empire is moribund. It's not a danger. The danger is Russia, because everybody knew Russia wanted to take Constantinople and saw itself as the third Rome, and saw itself as the successor of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, whose capital was Constantinople. So people, some of them best-selling authors and extremely clever publicists in the 1820s started writing, if the Greek Revolution hadn't happened as of 1821, we should have invented it, because here is a people that can be the rampart of the West there. Exactly 200 years ago, 1825, the famous French Protestant politician and liberal thinker Benjamin Constant was saying, if Greece is defeated by the Ottoman Empire, we will lose la garantie véritable de l'Occident contre l'Orient, the real guarantee. And he wasn't talking about the Ottoman Empire. He was clear. He said any danger that may come from the East.
You can map that whole conversation onto Ukraine today.
Exactly. You're reading my mind and I'm reading yours, thankfully. I was about to say, he also went on in the same pamphlet to say, here is we in Europe, in Western Europe, we are now, I'm afraid, a bit softened. We are not prepared to fight. We don't want to fight. We have our pleasures and our luxuries. He was a master of discussions of luxury and commerce and how it changes people's culture. He had discussed the differences between ancient and modern liberty and so on. So he knew what he was talking about. Here is a people who are prepared to fight and die for freedom. We need them. It's spooky how reminiscent it is of what is going on in Ukraine and with Ukraine right now as we speak.
The West is fighting for its freedom to the last Ukrainian.
Yes. So the longue durée idea, the fact that my study is a longue durée of the meanings of the term shows you that history matters and history can be useful if you re-look at it. But to come back to your question, because I'm not trying to avoid it, given that it means so many things, has meant so many things, does it mean something today? I'm saying, first of all, yes, we can decide what it means, because there is a battle about its meaning, and a side is winning that battle at the moment, and we both know what it is, and we've been talking about it earlier. And that's an enormous own goal for everybody else who doesn't agree with them, because the West can mean, and does mean, it's a long history. Like every history, identity, society, or civilization or culture, the history is messy. It has good and bad things. The West can be whitewashed by some people that it did only wonderful things, nonsense, and it can be criticized for everything that went wrong in the world, also nonsense. It is a culture. There is no culture, civilization, or group of societies that is completely innocent of any wrongs in its history. These things exist only in a place the ancient Greeks called no place, better known as utopia. So we can all criticize the West from the point of view of our utopias. But in terms of actual civilizations, and looking at the alternatives in the world today, here is a group of like-minded nations which share, to a great extent, similar political systems, similar systems of norms, similar ideas about the rule of law, dignity of human beings, freedom of speech, all sorts of things that, as a result of its checkered and messy history, can now be seen as Western primarily in the sense they have succeeded in the West. I'm not even claiming ownership. They are not Western. They belong to humanity. But they have succeeded in the West and in some other places, and sometimes they started in these other places. But for example, Christianity started in the Middle East. In the Middle East, Christianity is about to be eclipsed the way things are going, and there are very small minorities. Christianity thrived in Europe historically for various reasons. So a number of things: liberal democracy, freedom of speech, constitutional regimes, toleration, not because we're any better. I am with François Guizot, who not accidentally was a Protestant French historian and therefore a member of a minority, who famously defined European civilization as being constantly progressive for a very simple historical accident, because of a historical accident, that nobody prevailed. Of course, everybody wanted to abolish everybody else, but nobody prevailed. So in a small part of the world, people had to learn to live with diversity and struggle and antagonism, and nobody had the upper hand for forever or for too long to eclipse everybody else. So that civilization is that culture, that political culture is the result of our history. It's not eternal. Homosexuals were sent to prison in the liberal United Kingdom in the 1950s. Things evolve. Through the evolution of this history, we in Western Europe enjoy a certain culture that is similar, and the Americans, and long may it last. I believe it can stand for that liberal, tolerant civilization that allows self-criticism and self-correction. And it has two advantages. It's not a civilizational state like Russia or China, a civilization pretending to be a nation state. It's a number of states. So if one of them goes mad, the rest of them can step in. Right now, people are talking to Zelensky in 10, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom are trying to step in and find some balance, given that the leader of the other side is not behaving in a way they are very worried about. They may or may not succeed because there has been a balance since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War. One of the powers is not primus inter pares, it's indispensable, it's too powerful, and we have got that balance wrong. Maybe it's a wake-up call for Europe to coordinate better in terms of defense and depend less on the US, and it may be a good thing if that happens. We'll see. But I hope I answered. It's messy because the real world is messy, but I think it still stands for something. And I also hope America, because it's a democracy, may come back.
Well, let's hope so. I wonder whether the damage to that democracy is not too deep by now for it just to sort of revert to normal with a new president, especially if that president is J.D. Vance.
I agree with you for another reason. Even if it does, it would be bad for us if it had an unequivocally nice and friendly and soft-spoken president who is a Democrat, because we don't want to go back to things as normal, back to normal like with Joe Biden. We need to remember you cannot rely on America.
That situation has changed, and it's changed for good. I was the last episode of this series was with Mark Galeotti, the Russia expert, and we were talking about Europe, and he said, yes, I always wonder what Europe wants to be when it's grown up. And yes, I think perhaps today is one of the days when that's being decided. One thing we have to decide, I have to talk about when we talk about the West, the idea of the West, and today is Pankaj Mishra's book After Gaza, where he says, if there ever was a West, it's over now. It's lost all justification, all moral justification for its existence, because it's betrayed every one of its values. Of course, in its long history, in its long colonialist history, actually, as a European historian, you have to add, they treated the European poor and the European underclasses just as badly as they did colonial people, but that's just a little footnote. But today, and in front of all cameras, and with our knowledge, the West has allowed this to happen, so it should just basically decide on its own abolition.
That's an extremely good example of what I mean, though, by the people who say that have a very good solution, and the Greeks call it nowhere, and it's otherwise known as utopia. As opposed to what? Which alternative? So my reply is, the West has to apologize to it, has to be very ashamed for various things that are happening right now and have been happening for a long time, I agree. But we don't need to abolish the West. We need a better West. We need a new battle through the self-correction, through the self-criticisms that allow Pankaj Mishra to say these things freely in the West, by the way. And he doesn't live in India. He chooses to live in London, and it's his absolute right. I'm also a migrant. All I'm saying is, very many people vote with their feet, because you can say these things and say to the West how ashamed it should be, and say to the West that it should be abolished, and still be a major part of its debate, and actually not just listened to, but honored. But that's the best answer, the best example of my argument. My argument is, of course, I couldn't agree more. But that's exactly why we need to debate and improve the West, not abolish the West, because I'm not persuaded by any alternatives.
I always think it's important to remember that ideas are not wrong because they're being betrayed or mistreated, as they have been here. As a last point, because time is running away, but as a last point, I want to ask you something that is a very important element, I think, in this question, but one that is, I think, under-discussed because it's really, really unpopular and really, really unfashionable. And that's the role of elites in this whole thing. Who carries such an idea as the West? And if there is such a thing as an elite that is carrying this idea, for instance, through education, through a culture that goes through concert halls and theaters and books, and becomes a common culture that has a common idea of a civilization encoded in it. Here's a weird question. The world has become so rich so quickly recently, and we have effectively exchanged our elites. There's a lot of new money that is sloshing around, and the elites and the decision makers are others, but they're no longer traditional elites. They're, for instance, no longer educational elites. And for your membership of the elite, the question of how educated you are, how much you interact with culture, whether you have a position of that, an interest in that, has become almost relevant. You can be, if you never visit a theater, but you're really interested in football, that would have been a problem 80 years ago in an elite circles, but it is no longer. Now, this may either be a ridiculously conservative argument, or it may carry in it something about what makes a constitutive elite for a society and what happens when that elite is broken up from within.
Yeah, brilliant question to which I don't know if I can make justice, but just scratch the surface in the hope of further discussions and thoughts. You're absolutely right. There is a plutocratic elite that is destroying Western civilization while pretending to defend it against others. They have been helped by educational elites, as I alluded earlier, which were living in a bubble, and partly through hypocrisy, partly through naivete, have been saying things that allow these people that you're talking about to portray them as completely arrogant and elitist. I mean, it is ridiculous, but Boris Johnson and Donald Trump present themselves as disruptors and underdog. If you look at the wealth Donald Trump inherited and the circles he lived in New York, he's not exactly the underdog. And Boris Johnson, I won't even begin. So that people, they are not the same thing, by the way, those two, because one participates in the educational elites, but he doesn't admit it because he realizes it doesn't necessarily make him popular, or so he thought. Yes, I agree. That's why I keep saying we need a redefinition and a battle, and we shouldn't allow particular people to define the West as if it means only that, and therefore, so I don't care in the end of the day about words and names. I care about exactly the culture, the civilization, the text, the philosophy, the literature, the high culture that is endangered by both extremes now. It was arguably, many of us thought it was much more in danger by fashions in American universities and students that were understandably very passionate about justice and so on, and the way their academics, their professors, in order to be popular, would reinforce as opposed to balance. And so the abolition of the counseling of major texts in literature, philosophy, and so on, because somebody used a word that people wouldn't like today, had become ridiculous. The people who are the real danger now to our civilization and cultures and democracy use that to say, you see, they have abolished free speech, and now they are literally abolishing free speech in much more insidious ways, but they have been helped by the naivete or the hypocrisy of the other side, very sadly. That's why I am arguing for a muscular, liberal, centrist revival of sensible debate, proper freedom of speech. And we have resources in our culture, including not least John Stuart Mill, who, when a friend of his wrote to him and said, if he understood correctly, he was trying to encourage an elite in the book on liberty, Mill replied, I have made myself misunderstood if that's what you thought. What I want is to raise everybody to be an elite, everybody to become the best they can be through culture, education, freedom of speech, exposure to freedom of thought, and aspiring to flourish in any possible way culturally and so on. So, elitism is one of the badge bearers, one of the words that have done a lot of damage.
But this is so interesting. This is so interesting because, yes, elitism has become this standard accusation. But when you talked about the longue durée and, the long view of history, and you see basically, you said philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. I think it was Bertie Russell who put that into the world. There is very little new in the world intellectually since the first people put pen to paper, or perhaps chisel to stone. But ideas to flourish need to have carriers. They need to have a social movement to carry them. You see that very strongly in the area that I know a little bit about, the Enlightenment, where, ideas are picked up which has been knocking around in philosophical history for millennia. The equality of people, the equality of birth, the idea of human rights, etc. But suddenly they have a group to carry them, namely the rising middle class in the 18th century, who use these ideas to advocate for political power. Now, the West had a movement to carry it. A class of people, not so much a class, but a group of people to carry it. And it seems that this constitutive group, which is an elite not in financial terms, but in the terms that there is a cultural communality between them. And this is also carried by ideas, and not only by money, not only by possessions, but it is very much an idea-oriented project. That seems to change at the moment.
Yes, I see that, and I'm not particularly optimistic. I'm just saying we should try our best for them not to prevail. We should try to make sure different voices are heard. There are rich people who would support through charity other ideas to flourish, as opposed to the ideas of their plutocratic fellow rich that we are talking about. And if they see something growing, they might support it. So all I'm saying is, let's join the battle, and let's hope that the Philistines don't prevail. The Philistines that are now the new elite don't have to prevail. There are the pendulum swings, and people hopefully might start missing various things. I notice in students a tendency to return to what used to be very unfashionable, great texts and ideas and so on. And maybe it's not a sufficient sample yet, but things happen that always are noticed a bit later. So we'll see. I obviously share your anxiety and pessimism about the social history of ideas makes one anxious, because it's not just the ideas, it's how they are promoted, how much air they get, and of course, the elephant in the room, the technology and the algorithms that promote only the extreme views and the anger, as opposed to the sensible views. But I also detect a hunger for challenging them. I detect an anxiety. I obviously, like everybody, I may be in my bubble, although I'm not in a social media bubble. I mean, the people one meets are not always a good sample, but I hope there is an appetite for balanced debate and sensible discussion that may not disappear. We'll see. I know I'm not making sense right now, because I know that things don't look very good.
I think you're making perfect sense. Georgios Varouxakis, thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you for opening at the end of this, shall we say, slightly pessimistic hour, a little door towards a ray of light of perhaps the fact that this is also a question of generational change so often, and that perhaps a new generation is more interested in these ideas than the generations growing up under neoliberalism. It was a fabulous discussion. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your knowledge. And thank you all for listening to Georgios and to me in this discussion of, well, the history of the West and possibly even its future. And, well, do subscribe if you haven't done so yet, and tell all your friends and your favorite enemies about this fabulous show. We have great plans. Yes, I do want to rule the world. So, of course, you must be part of this great movement. Thank you so much, and see you next time. Georgios, thank you.